On Truth-Telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 20. The lure of the non-professional. Putting ever more balls into the air doesn't go without some risk. I would like to think I'm a skillful enough juggler to be forgiven letting a ball or two get away. The subject of truth-telling is complicated and even overcomplicated beyond my mere telling. Therefore it would be strange if the latter didn't show some signs of drifting. Digging into these old university papers, I realize I have to keep my eye on the 8-ball. I have to keep digging into an intellectual development heterogeneous enough but guided by a small number of identifiable elements. It is not for me to say they always produce top-flight work, but I can say they always produced a top-flight effort. Never in all my university days did I write an essay simply because it was an assignment. Every one of them was an intellectual challenge I was glad to take on. But before going on with my university studies, what is there to be said about that side of me seemingly so devoted to a non-professional mode? What ethic or aesthetic was operating? What erotic element, what sometimes fearful or fluid combination of these made me want to sidle up to the academic world in my own way? Made me want to come into the proximity of the professional in my own stealthy roundabout way, the good, the solid, the secure, the well-run, the efficient, the knowledgeable, and so on. For it is precisely this ambivalence, this attraction, repulsion that comprised my state and, to the degree that I fixated upon it and carried it along as a sort of calling or career, set me apart from virtually all others. But it was never so clear or clarion as to leave me with no moments of doubt. Moments in which I was discomforted and suspected that I was deceiving myself and aiming low rather than high. It is difficult to ignore the fact that most people with a will and a way move towards positions of authority and responsibility. As just one more person in the crowd, as just one more member of struggling humanity, I couldn't help but sometimes feel I was shirking my duty and not living up to my potential. Perhaps instances of these doubts and suspicions came to me when I erred from my customary path and imagined myself as one of the well-thinking majority. That goodly number of people who lead decent enough lives and who, if it weren't for that small grain of insincerity I always detected in them, would have surely been able to claim me as one of their own. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men. Leaning together. Headpiece filled with straw. Alas. With respect to this insincerity that troubled me, I was as sensitive to it as the fairy tale princess who couldn't sleep on account of the pee under her 20 mattresses. It seemed to me that, throughout my life, I had never met anyone who, having identified his personal interests with the interests of some institution or organization, didn't start to equivocate or speak in a hollow way or at best remain silent the moment he felt these interests threatened. There was a systematicity about it that I instinctively felt was a threat to my own particular interests. It kept me at a distance from the professional world as if I thought it might catch hold of me. Towards it I put up all the resistance of a dissident living in an oppressive regime or a martyr to the faith amongst those who turn apostate. All this I can attest to while still admitting I had moments of doubt and uncertainty. Never was it simply a case of telling myself that I couldn't be co-opted by the system, but only that it hadn't occurred up to the moment of thinking about it. The worry of being trapped in some false position was essentially the belief that the professional world was full of such traps. From politicians down, or, as some would say, from politicians up, there seemed to be this way of defending one's position or course of action that was necessarily closed off to self-criticism. Clearly there was this virtually universal preoccupation with projecting an image of confidence and authority that superseded any desire to go on record with one's faults and hesitations. Virtually every person in a public position was testimony to this. Criticism as mode of address was preponderantly, indeed, with few exceptions, outwardly directed. What passed for honesty under such conditions was how accurate one was in the criticism of the other and not the degree to which the intentional or motivational roots of it were exposed to the light of day. Though I identified insincerity and lack of openness with the professional world, I still didn't have a clear conception of how necessary and indispensable they are to it. It was as if I thought that everyone who was a part of this world had made a decision more in accordance with their own natures than, as I believe now, in accordance with the both apparent and not so apparent forces that rule it. Of course it is not infrequently the case that what starts off as second nature eventually enjoys all the appearance of the natural and is even worn with honor and distinction. Such no doubt was the illusion I had of the matter for a long time. I couldn't envisage all the various shades of struggle and resistance in people who, finally casting their vote for the ways of the world, which, to be thoroughly honest, also means taking on a different set of values that have their own ethical import, relegate all this turmoil to a past self too naive and idealistic for genuine work and accomplishment. How much of a life may be settled on the basis of what is most comfortable on a day-to-day basis? Whereas I didn't take fright at the prospect of, even at the age of 25, continuing on for several years as a manual laborer, another quite possibly would have thought it a terrible fate. Such a person would have wielded his shovel as if he were condemned to forced labor. Every moment doing such work would have seemed to him a wasted moment. Any news he happened to receive about his friends' progress in their careers would have tormented him. Unhappy would his days have been as he saw himself losing various opportunities to improve his lot in life. Had I been one who had had in his sights the more or less familiar and conventional ways of success, I no doubt would have been that sufferer. I would have been one who was prepared to forego vague hopes and dreams that seemed unrealizable in order to grasp the more substantial. Or else I would have been one who, for whatever reason, had already forgotten the imaginings and impulses of childhood. Had I been one who suffered from tormenting doubts in this area and wanted to rid myself of them, I would have taken stock of all the possible ways of developing myself along a more or less well laid out and secure path. Accordingly, I would have been one of the many who were prepared to have anesthetized certain parts of their youthful conscience. If the latter has nothing to do with openness and an unwillingness to separate head from heart, then I miss my guess that this not only has a natural home in youth but a natural danger in growing older and getting on. Is it not safe to think that, given what I could endure and what I could not, I had no choice but to stay away from work in an office, a bank, a school, an insurance company, and other places where professional comportment often means being a three-quarter self? A three-quarter expression of one's thinking, viewing, opining, feeling, and acting self. Could I ever have had it as one of my many skills and habits to leave a part of myself at home in the morning and return to it in the evening? Could it have been possible for me to have been a kind of self-explorer, self-experimenter, and, indeed, self-inventor while essentially putting on an act every day? Is there any reason not to think I wouldn't have been able to tolerate such circumstances for very long? Or any reason not to think I would have been in danger of growing violent if for some reason I were constrained to remain where I no longer wish to be? Question all I may about the possibility of doing things differently, it is still a fact I never felt myself in revolt against my situation. And God only knows I had enough time to think about it, to measure the compass of my airy thoughts and inclinations against the solid acreage that others staked out. Two desirables, to be sure, but to the first, already bequeathed to me, I felt myself a privileged heir, the very lord of a boundless and magnificent domain, a land of never-ending surprises, adventures, and discoveries. To be unimpeded in thought and imagination, to go wherever one had the strength and daring to go, always seemed to me the greatest blessing and highest honor that could be conferred on a life. All else about it, be it as rough and unpleasant as might be, came with the territory that, as an elevated self, as a sort of prince in disguise wandering about his kingdom and taking it all in at close hand, I traversed with an inquisitive and almost voluptuous eye. What's he saying? I don't know. But I wish he'd do it on his own time. I'm struggling with the idea that I couldn't have done it all differently. That I'm not just deluding myself with this rationalistic reconstruction of the past. I wanted to feel the extraordinary near to me. If I couldn't have gone to the Himalayas without forfeiting my university studies, or if I couldn't have changed my approach to these studies without forfeiting the sense of a spiritual Himalayas, what other choice did I have? University lay open to me, but only as a relatively narrow path that had to be navigated with care and precision. Everything that I drew from these studies had to be complementary to my other thoughts, or else I would have surely lost my way. With the tragically heroic being such a predominant theme in these studies, how could I have pulled this off without having a commensurate self-image? And if I were not to be truly preposterous in this admittedly ill-defined and often barely known venture, how could I have managed it without taking on those activities and projects that at least didn't grossly contradict it? When an author of note speaks on such matters, it may be of interest. But when one is not such an author but is nonetheless trying to convince oneself and others that one should be recognized as such, then it's almost painfully embarrassing because, quite frankly, the author in question simply hasn't earned the right to his sense of self-importance. I realize that part of my effort is to make the claim that no one has ever held to the subject of truth-telling with greater persistence than I have. It may grate upon the nerves to hear it so proclaimed, but it certainly can't be faulted for being coy and indirect. I move towards an elaboration of this claim with the belief that it is no less than an indispensable part of my subject. There is then in some sense a constantly self-justifying effort that, paradoxically enough, endangers it. But whatever redemptive or corrective element there is in all this, and I of course take it that there is, lies in the fact that even this endangering aspect is part of my subject, part of what I endeavor to take up and tell the truth about. He stands on guard for truth-telling and even against himself. In the meantime, the subject finds no center except his own self-centeredness. I forego the conventions that make it appear that it is otherwise for most human beings. As much as we draw the world into ourselves, it is our stage and set that is similar to but never exactly the same as those of others. One meets certain people, one reads certain books, one sees certain sights and, no matter how multiple and varied these are, the result is a unique configuration of ideas, emotions, and images. If I spend so much time on my thinking, feeling, and imagining self, it is not to shut out the rest of humanity, what an absurdity this would be, but rather to tell the truth about the relation of the one to the other. He's reduced us to mere shadows of ourselves, and this is what he wants to hold up as representative of what he's taking on. Let me be clear about one thing. I see a great gap between the manual laborer I was for so many years and an Einstein, a Galileo, or a Newton. Never did my mind focus with laser-like intensity on a few particular problems that arose as question marks in a more or less well-defined field. Never did I study to become the grandmaster of this or that game, but rather moved from one to the other with the dilettante-ish interest and passion of a collector. Consequently, whatever I had to deliver still remained embryonic at an age when others have already brought forth a fully formed scientific or artistic work, or even a body of works. Let me be called an intellectual mountebank for laying things out as I do and trying to work myself into this illustrious company if it so happens that all the paths to genius have been numbered and catalogued. Since no one before had thought to take the hyphen away and make truth-telling one word, I have at least this as grounds to think that a new subject has been opened up and must be treated like no other. Here's the question I put to my first-year students, Andrew. The answer I was looking for was when a machine can answer all the questions put to it in such a way that the questioner cannot distinguish it from a human being, then, for all intents and purposes, it has a mind. We don't say someone doesn't have one simply because he or she can't come up with original ideas. We only expect the person to formulate clear questions and answers to what's already known. Let me put it this way. He or she who can grasp a field of study but not reconceptualize it is short of imagination but not mind. A machine can likewise deal with all sorts of problems, but, if it doesn't do that rare thing of rendering them null and void with some new vision or theory, we wouldn't say it doesn't think, else we'd all be caught short. I think it is in the nature of truth-telling for people to talk past each other in much the same way that characters in a Chekhov play do. Anyone who has attended a scholarly conference must have had the feeling at some point that only politeness and form prevent interlocutors from saying things like, "Excuse me. I've only been half listening to you. Since I've already got my own point of view and since I'm here to defend it, I'm really only interested in yours insofar as I think it's coinciding or conflicting with my own." But I know very well that such a half-listening self has been the nature of my own polemical being and, from everything I have been able to observe, the nature of polemics tout court. Even when it is a case of taking one's time and responding to this or that in a written debate, chances are that certain subtleties and nuances of the opponent's arguments aren't going to find their way into the counter-arguments. But it is not the place here to go into this, to take up at length what should be taken up when I recount my graduate studies. All I need to say is that, even with respect to what I'm doing now, the polemical can't be dispensed with. Different points of view link a whole constellation of elements that leave virtually nothing untouched. Nothing that isn't resonating and reverberating and having the same effect on something else. As much as one sometimes wishes for consensus and agreement, it would assuredly mean, if taken to the extreme, the computerization of human intelligence. Yet short of a decimation of the human race that would only leave machines behind, this intelligence rests forever implicated and even over-implicated in all else. It is my task to give testimony to this for reasons that, as I have already demonstrated, lose themselves in the heterogeneity of a lived life. Am I to be frightened? Am I to be cowed? Am I to turn my back on the tradition of thought that has been the very backbone of all human achievement? Am I not to think that Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and so many others are giants to this puny rebel? Has the tradition not shown itself sufficiently strong and flexible to take in, and I would almost say pass by if not take in, 1,000 such sideshow philosophers? You know the old saying, the dogs bark while the caravan goes by. So it is with his present puffing himself up that, like his poor sister's ego, only needs the pinprick of saying passons to deflate it to naught. On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 21. The lure of the unprofessional. The system builders should be credited for much. Bridge builders are they that allow a whole mass of humanity to cross from one way of thinking to another. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But I have promises to keep. And miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. There is something about crudity that has always attracted me. That swam about as freely and uninhibitedly in my character as insincerity does in many an honest person's. How is it that this often ignoble habit and trait couldn't break the glass of my self-image? How is it that I could be so hyperhygienic in one area while fouling myself in another? What would a good bourgeois say about a man who can't tell a white lie but can do a black deed? Is it likely that, if he heard me argue that there is an irreducible contradictoriness in all of us, he would look upon me with a more favorable eye? If I myself have used this argument for justifying low and unseemly behavior, would I be in a position to deny that my reasoning on the matter is highly suspect? On the other hand, I feel quite right to argue that, inasmuch as these meanderings have been a part of my past no less than my present, I have always been partial to the self-justification of my immoral behavior and to the suspicion against it. Which is as much to say that, although my behavior may be immoral, it has never been so immoral as to make me unwilling to tell the truth about it. My job as a cab driver, initially this was either seasonal or part-time work, allowed me to see how by slow degrees the libido can be given ever greater license. Along with providing the field for a highly extended if casual study of diverse humanity, this job functioned as a sort of moving laboratory for self-experiment and self-observation. How inept I felt at times while doing something that is not supposed to require a great deal of intelligence. Keenly aware when I thrilled at some little adventure and violently self-critical when it went astray and sometimes even turned it into a hellish mess, no doubt because my reactions were often excessive, I egoistically ran through it all the thought that never would someone enter my cab with an intelligence equal to mine. Such egoism was in fact my psychological mainstay as I went from being a kind of stumblebum driver to a rather lecherous one. Is this his way of providing character references? It's better to ignore him. In order to be on the track of something, I must check out the hypothesis that my life has been on the track of something. Truth-telling, cab driving, and a kind of tightrope walking are all things I have done that didn't fly off in all directions because the first was the strong pinions upon which, condor-like, I followed my course. What an arbitrary thing it is to think that this subject should only exist, if it should exist at all, in the university. To let it move out into the world and to see the world as its proper setting is what strikes me as the intellectually honest move. Let anyone who wishes to tell me differently also tell me they have answered all questions about the nature of truth and what it is to tell it. It's dreadful. This spitting on the hard work of so many people. What a headless fool I could be at times when, not knowing the city well, I had difficulty finding some street, address, building, or pickup spot. Then, like a tormented, raging beast, I would drive around, cursing and swearing like a maniac, exhibiting the excessive speed and rude reckless behavior for which taxi drivers are known. I would often fight my way through traffic, streetlights, stop signs, and all manner of human or inhuman obstacles as if I were fighting my way through enemy lines. Sheer aggression in the line of duty, in the thought that the customer was either getting terribly impatient or that, after all the struggle to get where he would be long gone. In all honesty, I was sometimes on the verge of being as reckless as when, in my younger years, I drove while my faculties were impaired. From the point of view of pure civility and civilized behavior, I was no more my regular self than a soldier who is trained to kill people. Insofar as I felt myself assigned to a task, mission, or duty, and insofar as the field proved to be obstacle, lure, resistance, deception, and sometimes danger, it took on the dimensions of a battlefield drained of all blood but what pulsed in my fevered brain. I'm going to lie down in my office. It has been said that character is destiny. It could just as easily be said that character is circumstance. Had my life flowed out as one long European trip, had I always had enough resources simply to move about and meet people on a casual and friendly basis, I doubt there would have been many occasions when the less civil side of me would have risen up. But since I was forced to enter into a system of external demands and expectations that either I couldn't always live up to or else were always susceptible to taking arbitrary and abrupt turns, I was subject to all the attendant emotions and impulses of a harassed and beleaguered human being. I've never felt such violence in myself and never felt the need to be uncivil towards others. Of course, had I been a different sort, I would have searched for work where incivility, my own or others, wouldn't have likely arisen as an issue. Incivility brought me close to something raw, something unpleasant, something demeaning and degrading, and yet, something entirely itself, non-veiled, non-duplicitous, non-alloyed to base metal because it is this metal. How often is the latter counterfeited in comparison with gold or silver, the valued ideal and its various forms and embodiments? If all human acts were divided between politeness and incivility, I would say that nowhere is there a more thoroughly consistent agreement between thought and word, between intention and act, than where the first is absent. When a Shakespearean character vituperates another, it is as if a beautiful mask suddenly drops and reveals an ugly but all too human face. If one is more repelled by beautiful masks that feign to be non-masks than by the coarse features of a non-feigning face, then the best way to spend the better part of one's time, apart from being alone and in the company of the ideal that one either presumes to be or has the presumption to think unfeigned, is in the company of the latter. Am I dreaming? Is this the evil genius? Everything seems normal except this voice that comes from nowhere. To think of all the people I met, the brief exchanges, the brief events, sometimes banal, sometimes dramatic, that have their greatest reality now in a fading memory. In this rather limited and personal zone shared perhaps by a few limited, scattered, and fading others. How vulnerable then the so-called true report to the so-called false one. The what took place that is in principle verifiable to the account of it that can escape this principle either wholly or in part. All that guides me as I grope back over the past are various impressions about a particular city's day and night life. Things that span work and pleasure, health and sickness, riches and poverty, sobriety and drunkenness, wisdom and stupidity, happiness and sadness, seriousness and mischief, goodwill and ill will, order and disorder. Can the truth status of any individual detail at this point in time be more important than simply the wealth and diversity of details? Can what I report as having happened during many private and obscure moments be determined on an ontological basis more firm than the report itself? Thus it must be that, speaking of such things, I tell the truth in the more general and objective sense, that is, not just to myself, only insofar as my report manages to carry the same weight and conviction that others feel when they examine themselves with rigor. It is the character of this report then that ultimately proves or disproves it, the various signs it shows of not wishing to hide or hold back or, for that matter, to forge additional experiences about the past beyond what seems to be unavoidable. I feel now I'm supposed to say something. But all I can think of is you've got to have a minimum of belief. Well, I have said that I was attracted to the wide world as a classroom, and it now seems appropriate to bring in another image, the restricted or confined space of a taxicab as a private booth, closed office, or confessional. So many suffering heads trying to patch together a dignity of sorts. So many lives growing up as ragged weeds from earliest years. So many successful or moderately successful people living their compact and modular lives. So many earnest lives being lived all over. So many revealing snatches and brief conversations that made it seem as if intellectualism was very rare and common sense and pragmatism universal. So much in fact as to make me feel I was in a human machine as part of it and not only the driver of a merely man-made one. Silence. Whatever we can't speak of should be passed over in silence. It was this sort of thing, the machine couldn't be dispensed with, and yet everything that was low-grade, that seemed to be rough, coarse, and neglected because it wasn't part of the machine, struck me as being desirable and necessary, at least in the large, as being somehow more than it was by virtue of being what it was. In all this I couldn't think of giving credit to people for making conscious moves along ethical lines, though this could certainly work its way in somewhere down the line, but simply the indifferent, mysterious, beyond good and evil constitution of the whole. A kind of order/disorder as much identifiable with the human machine and its dehumanizing effects as it was with the rough and barbarous elements that strangely humanized it. He thinks he finds bottom by seeing none. In this outer zone where prejudices are amply viewed, where conventional cover-ups simply don't have much reason to thrive, I moved as one with an antenna-like grasp of the limited reflection that formed these prejudices. That was largely what it was as limited thought and thought production because of its inability to return to these prejudices in a doubling back movement. In fact, nothing seemed more universal to me than this lack of reflective dexterity. From the highest to the lowest it was hard to find anyone who questioned and reflected with an effort to get behind himself. On the other hand, given that so much is universally hidden away, I should have been cognizant of a largely unreflected prejudice in myself. Which is to say that people are always more of a world in their cognizant being than they give themselves out to be. Limiting themselves to being relatively consistent in their utterances and outlooks, they seem stupider, simpler, and more fixed and one-dimensional than they actually are. Were this not the case, there would be more than a few people who wouldn't be able to spend barely a moment thinking about a point of view different from their own. Even the most thick-headed and unwavering dolt can be made to waver in his arguments, so long as he is willing to argue, by being reminded of other arguments and points of view. It is this repertoire of arguments and viewpoints that is always alive in some sense and to some degree in the most varied range of people. Like a great stack of cards in a tremendous game, it must always be drawn from in those countless situations where to communicate with someone quickly and effectively counts for far more than being innovative and original. Let him go on. He's not the only one who can see through a glass darkly. Prejudice is a sensitive issue. Few people go out of their way to make their own a topic of discussion. It is usually a case of expressing a prejudice or else denouncing others for expressing theirs. Sometimes the most intelligent, well-meaning, and cultivated people seem little different from others in this respect. Reaching back into my memory, I can see once again that young couple I picked up very early in the morning. The more assertive and talkative of the two was a black woman. Although showing signs of a limited education, she spoke to her companion as one who was well versed on the subject of racism and not simply well schooled by the experience of it. But little did I dwell upon this minor incongruity. It was rather the later event that struck me. Continuing her discourse right up to the time I reached her door, she then told me she had to run into the house to get some money. Being the rather naive driver I was at the time, meaning in effect I still hadn't developed a systematic or working prejudice against poor people, natives, and inhabitants of the demi-monde, I waited for about 10 minutes before I finally abandoned all hope that she would return. Later I told this incident to a woman I had recently become friendly with. We were seated on a park bench on a beautiful day. The woman I was with was not only black but a journalist from South Africa seeking work in Canada. She was not only a fellow tenant in a modest downtown apartment block but one who had been gracious enough to look over and comment on one of those terrible attempts at a play I was forever working on. A second surprise came out of this whole affair when, in telling my story about the black woman who, along with her white companion, had cheated me, I spoke about the incongruity of the woman's complaining about racism and then promptly committing an act that could hardly be construed as working in favor of its elimination. No sooner had I delivered this critique when my well-spoken neighbor, looking stricken, jumped to her feet and walked away. It was rather tactless. With people I have no reason to think unintelligent and close-minded, I have always preferred to speak my mind and risk giving offense than to hold like glue to the seemingly correct, proper, prejudice-free, and I might as well add, superficial. My thought was always that, if someone judged me to be in the wrong, he or she should stand their ground and make their case against me. Arguably my greatest prejudice has always been against those who lack courage. His sister said, "Yes, I remember, it's so easy for the strong to be strong and assign it all to themselves and not to luck." A large percentage of my customers were native people. For a number of years, I was very much on edge with them. Several reasons could be cited for this. However, if I were to sum up the matter most perspicuously, I would have to go beyond my relations simply with them. I would have to say that being on edge with natives and other disadvantaged people, perhaps 95% of the natives I encountered were disadvantaged, was tied up with the fact that it took me several years of driving around the city before I got to know it well. Before I got to know it like the back of my hand so I could be confident in dealing with the most troublesome situations. Not knowing the city well as a system of roads, routes, residential, industrial, commercial, educational, governmental, cultural, recreational, transport, and health facilities was definitely a drawback and an inhibiting and even intimidating factor. Getting lost, making mistakes, wasting time, upsetting people, etc. were elements so common in the first few years that I can only compare it to struggling to learn a new language. Stepping back from it all, I can't help but reflect on the large number of taxi drivers who were immigrants and who were not only confronted with learning the language of the city but English itself. It is difficult for me now not to appreciate what they had to contend with. In any event, the business of learning a new language was complicated by the fact that not all segments of the city used the same one. The poor areas where unemployment, alcohol, drugs, prostitution, crime, violence, and the like prevailed produced a dialect of behavior that was class isolation and ghettoization personified. When I first started driving, I felt much less the master of my situation than I did later. Much less in control of my cab once I had a fare and was somewhere between A and B. Besides the problem I was having with the language of the city, there was also this problem with the dialect, this often quick to anger or show your fangs way of speaking that was not habitual with me. Given that I was quite conscious of being in a service industry, I acted with customary deference to people irrespective of where I picked them up. I accorded all the same level of civility in such a way that I often felt myself at a disadvantage with those whom I have been calling the disadvantaged. For it was with them and not with better-off types that occasions would arise wherein I would be abused, threatened, cheated, intimidated, and so on. No lack of aggression and violence was there amongst some of them and, given that they had been disadvantaged all their lives, I suppose it was natural for them to take advantage of some situations. At this point I could deliver numerous anecdotes to justify my slow but steady drift towards a working prejudice and on-the-job racial policy. It would have its sensational and self-indulgent side and, like the fate divers of a newspaper, exhibit or engender feelings of moral superiority. But because my task is to tell the truth about myself, I must forego this route and focus on the twin curiosity and moral superiority that kept me alive and enthusiastic as I toured the human zoo and studied up close some of its specimens. Not leaving aside the matter of prejudice, I would say that learning to operate with the presumption that a certain segment of society had it in its power to make my life miserable ultimately saved me from a great deal of misery. I'm tempted to state my working prejudice and on-the-job racial policy formulaically to avoid soft-peddling them, or maybe to soft-pedal them. Although I have never considered these practices to be unjustified, I have always been sensitive to the fact that, under different circumstances, they either would have been or could have become so. For inasmuch as they contained the seeds of cruelty and calculated indifference, they were in effect what exists everywhere. Practices then that often seem justified or justifiable but have the potential to nourish these seeds either without reference to an altered situation or else in accordance with external conditions radically favorable to their monstrous growth and proliferation. So this was my working prejudice and on-the-job racial policy. 1. White person plus suburban residence equals 1% probability of my being verbally harassed, cheated out of my fare, having the taxicab damaged or dirted, etc. 2. Native person plus inner city residence equals 10% probability of the same occurring. Accordingly, I systematically discriminated against the second group by not granting it the automatic right to be trusted in the general middle-class way and to be treated with what might be called middle-class courtesy and respect. Although 9 out of 10 customers from the second group were not much different from those of the first, apart from minor considerations such as non-tipping, coarse language, poor dress, and the like, the 1 out of 10 who made all the difference and who sometimes caused me serious trouble was sufficient to put me on the defensive. Or, more accurately, on the track of becoming less defensive insofar as I could find ways to avoid being victimized by, when necessary, going on the offensive. I get into a taxi. Go someplace. Sometimes they're dirty. What more do I think about? Chalmers. Oh, good Lord. What are you doing? Did you hear the latest, Theo? A course on prejudice. Mainly how to justify it. It woke me up like a bad dream. I'm afraid we're never going to get rid of him. There's a glass. Help yourself, Theo. I'm taking the day off. You know I don't drink, Chalmers. What's got into you? Isn't the question rather what's got into us? No, it isn't because we're only in this situation on account of him. But are we still ourselves, Theo, you and me? I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just going to say that we're struggling to be ourselves, maintain our sanity, in a hellish situation. As philosophers, shouldn't we examine it? No, I'm not about to play Descartes and I suggest you curb this tendency of yours to play Thoreau. You know what I mean. Bringing up big philosophical questions at the most inopportune times. Luncheons, committee meetings, and once, you remember, when I invited you to the house and my wife had over the Greek ambassador. Really, Chalmers, I'm sorry, old man, but it's something I've been meaning to bring up for a long time. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words and, though a verbal picture can easily take up as many, it may still capture dozens of interfused elements that would require a matching exposition 10 times as long. With this in mind, I'm prompted to bring up one incident that, with no less reference to the kind of animal I could become than to the humans you just mentioned, captures the good, the bad, and the ugly of my life as a cab driver. It started off as a busy Saturday night in the middle of summer. I was 35 at the time and, although I had been driving on and off for several years, I still wasn't as adept as I would be when, 3 or 4 years later, I was forced to work full-time. Around midnight I got a call that sent me out to the very limits of the city. There I found a young native boy, about 9 years old, patiently waiting at a phone booth. In his possession was a small run-down bicycle. After I had put it in the trunk, got behind the wheel, and had him seated in the back, he explained to me that he had left the inner city with an older friend and, both on bicycles, they had cycled around for several hours, always moving away from the downtown until, for some reason, they had become separated. Finding himself so far out, worn out by his adventure, and not sure of his way home, he had called his family to arrange to have him picked up. The first unsettling moment of this soon-to-be very rough night was when, upon finding out that he had been away from home for 6 or 7 hours and then remarking that his parents must have been worried about him, I heard him answer, "No, they're drinking." It was with some trepidation that I finally arrived in the darkened center of the low-rental housing complex. Presumably the planners of it thought it was necessary to grant the tenants a good deal of unlighted parking space. After I had unloaded the bicycle and had my young customer lead me towards his unit, I noticed some adolescents loitering about. Then my attention was drawn to the brightly lit windows and open door where a lively party was underway. I entered the unit, the usual dingy living quarters that one finds in this part of the city, with the boy who promptly disappeared while I, waiting uneasily by the door, listened to blaring country music and loud voices that issued from the back. After a time the boy returned with an old woman, probably his grandmother, who was clutching a $20 bill. It seemed that all was going to end well when, all of a sudden, another woman entered the scene. By the way she shook and scolded the boy, I could only suspect that she was his mother, although the degree of violence she used might have suggested otherwise. Turning upon me then, she fiercely told me that I hadn't picked up the boy where I said I did and therefore wasn't going to get paid. Instead of walking out of a bad situation, I began to argue with her. In the meantime the poor grandmother, still clutching the $20 bill, stood in the background. Beside her the boy with tears in his eyes. Then it came. The younger woman pushed me towards the door and, before I knew it, I had hit her. And before I got back to the taxi, I realized I had made a mistake. A veritable lynch mob came after me and hauled me out of it. Screaming their lust for revenge, they scratched and tore and punched away at me with a certain degree of ineffectuality that I can only put down to their years. Nevertheless I did receive a few solid punches. But all in all I managed to stay on my feet and find the opening to take to my heels. Running to a nearby busy street, I flagged down a cab and was promptly taken to the police station. There I waited for a couple of hours before being taken back to the scene of the crime. My crime, their crime, the police officers weren't sure. For it never entered my head to give them an account any different from the one I'm giving now. What do you make of that, Chalmers? Thoreau. Chalmers, I know your hero is Wittgenstein. Let's not pursue the matter. You've always been a credit to the department. I've been teaching Gadamer for the past 20 years. I know. I only meant you have a soft spot for those philosophers who think it should be lived and breathed. Tell me, just to divert matters, have you noticed how filthy the cabs are in this city? I took one from the airport last Sunday and it was full of rubbish. All over the floor. When I tried to say something about it to the driver, he could barely understand me. Really, I think it's high time they imposed an English course on people who take up that line of work. What does it matter to me that other people are better behaved when I know that chances are, they're less honest? That they cover up so much and feign a control of their inner and outer lives that every good writer knows is the crooked backbone of a frail humanity. Which is as much as to say that what is called order and control is inextricably bound up with what is the image of it. And that honesty and openness about this are only valued in minor doses and in relatively isolated areas. Such an area is where I am now and where the strict philosopher never is. He who tells the truth while exhibiting great control over his subject, who exhibits no doubts about this control, and who doubts, dismisses, or in some way neutralizes anyone who has such doubts. What impudence! Jumping from cab driving to philosophical turf. Are we to recommend him for a special chair in our department? Letting savagery and buffoonery take over. Hitting women. I don't think he's arguing he should take control, Theo. Just that there isn't the control in a philosophy department or book or whatever that you and I give out. You and I. Well, our crowd. People who often have to give the appearance of being on top of things when they're not, and, well, I'm sure you've felt that. I've never played the guru. I'll be retiring in 6 months, Theo. So I'm taking the opportunity to speak my mind. Chalmers, I didn't suspect you had this problem. Yes, it's been gnawing at me for a good long time. I once had a teacher, believe it or not, who actually thought his thoughts in class. How I wish I could have followed his example. Chalmers, I wasn't referring to that. My honesty had its limits. I lied and cheated on occasion. Although I can't remember telling any serious lies, I certainly told small ones. And as for cheating, well, it usually happened over change and when I didn't like the customer. Do you hear this, Chalmers? Do you hear this? There's the proof. A working dishonesty harnessed to a working prejudice. A taxi driving Thoreau who hasn't even got the decency to go out into nature and be pure. I also picked up prostitutes and got into the habit of using them. Some were even minors. Chalmers, if there were a way to turn off this pornographic site, this strip show, this indecent way of exposing an allegedly philosophic mind, I'd do it. As it stands, we must simply bear it with as much dignity as we can. The whirligig of time is the whirligig of every day and every week. Week after week. Some things step into view for the first time. Others disappear. It was only after I had lost my youth that the very young took on an allure they never had before. Chalmers, I'm going to do something I've never done before. Hand me that glass. Theo. Fill it up. I'm going to try to get it down. A long way away from a Marquis de Sade, but not so far away from a faltering and transgressing priest. That about sums it up. Sexuality is that turbulent subject so out in the open as a vast public property and so secret and furtive as innumerable private transactions. I rather wish he'd move on to something else. What's that line in Hamlet? Treat every man after his desert and who should escape whipping. Well, there's definitely a satirical element that comes from having to make them talkative. Many an academic, were he confronted with a similar situation, would simply clam up. I have never yet encountered one who impressed me as being more than intelligent, competent, civil, hard-working, fair-minded, and sometimes witty and humorous. It was only in books I met those others who could be all this and something else that I'm tempted to call errant. The capacity to depart from the tried and true that, good or bad, is the way of genius. Very charitable, isn't he, Chalmers? Crooked paths. The way of genius, Blake, isn't it? And we're just simple underlaborers. I have been masturbating all my life and what I'm doing now is only the most elegant, protracted, and heroic form of it. The genealogy of myself as a truth-teller requires stating what is unpleasant and impure in order to be pure. Pure in one way and in one movement that can only distinguish itself by drawing itself towards and squaring itself off with the mixed company it habitually keeps. That I got into fights, cheated, lied, whored, and did so always with some measure of restraint or reason were the weeds that never over in the spiritual garden I may claim to have cultivated. We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Chalmers, what's got into you? Shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. You're drunk. I'm just testing the limits of language. Everything from an early Wittgensteinian point of view should draw us a picture of the world. Otherwise it's nonsense. An independent part of the world, you mean? A set of objects and the relations between them that correspond to the logic of propositional language. The glass is on the table or the glass is not on the table. But not there is a pink elephant under my desk. I suppose we must pass the time somehow. There is more between heaven and earth than in your philosophy, Horatio. You should have stayed with your dream of the theater, Andrew. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, they have their exits and their entrances. It's a damn frightful thing. War. War against professionals and professionalism. A private war conducted from the back of a classroom. Certainly not merciless, rowdy, vainglorious or cruel. At least not the vast bulk of the time. War against what I didn't hate but couldn't always like. War against what I didn't disrespect but couldn't always respect. What was less a bona fide threat from without than from within? As if it were a vast doctrine preached largely in the practice or in countless indirect ways to discourage wide openness, radical self-critique, and the shaking of the foundations. As if the search for truth so earnestly pursued should have its scheduled flight paths from which nothing should divert save all in the past that had already done so. The continual demand not so much articulated as institutionalized that stressed a recognizable and agreed-upon starting point. That was not lacking in sense from the perspective of what is social and needs to be learned as such, but rather all too full of this sense and no other. The feeling then almost of an adolescent perpetually rebelling against a necessary but constraining parent. What others shook off for the sake of becoming responsible and successful adults struck me as treason, a betrayal of their youth, its knightly quality that was as hard to find in the professional world as a fair maid to rescue from a dragon. Yes, no doubt I had already personified truth as a woman without knowing it, and before I had ever read Nietzsche's account of her as a coy, veiled, secretive, and discountenancing beauty.